Welcome, everyone. I'm Karin Christensen with the Newberry Library. Thank you for joining us for today's program, Astrolabes and Armillary Spheres, Scientific Instruments and Prints in the Renaissance. The Newberry is an independent research library in Chicago with collections spanning more than 6 centuries of human history in Europe and the Americas. We've been free and open to the public since 1887. We have recently reopened our doors to visitors and readers. You can visit our website, newberry.org, to make an appointment to do research in the reading rooms. Today's program is co-sponsored by the Kress Foundation, and it is aligned with our current exhibit, Renaissance Invention. You can drop by the library without an appointment, Tuesday through Friday afternoons, to see it in person, and also our other fall exhibition, Decision 1920, a return to normalcy. The Rosenberg Bookshop at the Newberry is also open Tuesday through Friday afternoons, and now you can always shop online at our website. For the safety of our community, our public programs currently remain virtual. Visit our website to learn more about our many digital resources, online classes, and public programs done virtually like this one. I also encourage you to follow Newberry on social media for more opportunities to engage with our collections, our staff, and stories that bridge the past and the present. Today's program is one example of the Newberry Library's civic commitment to public education and intellectual engagement. Bringing together communities of scholars, students, and the public to discuss ideas that matter in our world today is central to the Newberry's mission. During the program, please enter your questions in the Q&A feature on Zoom or in the comments section if you're joining us on Facebook or the YouTube live stream. As time permits, our speakers will respond to your questions. Now I'd like to introduce my colleague, Suzanne Carr-Schmidt, who co-curated the Renaissance Invention exhibition.
Thank you very much, Karin. May we have the first slide of the exhibition? For those of you who can't make it to Chicago, we have a robust group of digital resources relating to the show, but I wanted to give you a little bit of a taste of what we've done here. This is, as you'll be able to literally walk through parts of the exhibit. Can I see the next slide? These are details from a series of 20 prints about innovation, one of which is the cannon, the gunpowder. As gunpowder, you can see a cannon here from the Art Institute. And the show, called the Nova Aperta, is about the new discoveries that were deemed to be important to Europe in the late 16th century, produced by an artist called Johannes Stradamus. May I have the next slide? Here are the first 10, and we thought it would be a wonderful opportunity to bring two scholars of prints and of scientific instruments together to discuss them, because not only are there military items in this wonderful group of engravings, but there are so many of them about navigation, including the encounter with the New World. May I have the next slide, please? Here's the second room of our exhibition, including instruments from the Adler armor from the Art Institute, and about 60 books and prints from the Newberry's collection. If you go to the next slide. This is a close-up of some of the instruments we'll be discussing today, and I'm going to introduce our speakers, who I hope will be able to come online so you can see them. All right, so our two speakers or conversationalists are Susan Dackerman, the director of the Cantor Art Center at Stanford University. We're very lucky that she can still join us despite the pandemic, and she has worked before on some of the most innovative printmaking that has ever happened in the world, from the 16th century, 15th, 16th century to the present. The exhibition that I contributed to back in 2011-12, Prints in the Pursuit of Knowledge in Early Modern Europe, was at Harvard Museum. And we'll see Pedro Raposo is the curator and director of collections, and we are so grateful to them for still loaning us these wonderful objects for the exhibition, despite everything and despite being closed. Pedro was part of the symposium last 2 springs ago that became the exhibition catalog, and he contributed to writing for it. And Susan very generously was one of our first readers and blurb writer. So we're very happy that they've been involved and want to hear what they have to say about the objects in the prints in the exhibition and the instruments themselves. All right, take it away.
We have the first slide, please. And before I get started, I want to thank Leah Markey and Suzanne Carr-Schmidt and the team at the Newberry for inviting me to participate in this conversation with Pedro. I'm so sorry I am not able to get to Chicago at this time to see the exhibition. But let me begin here by talking about the frontispiece of the print series that the exhibition revolves around. So as you know, the topic today is prints and astrolabes and armillary spheres, essentially prints and scientific instruments. And I'm going to begin by talking about prints as instruments and printmaking as part of the world of discovery that was happening in the early modern period. So the print series that is the focus of the exhibition highlights new discoveries and inventions. And what you're looking at is essentially the title page and index of the first half of that series. And what I mean by that is that it essentially indexes the inventions that will be depicted on subsequent sheets. Primary to this image is the printing press, which you can see at the top center of the image under the cartouche that gives the series title, the Nova Reperta. And the printing press there is essentially ready to go. On the ground before it are stacks of paper and daubers to apply ink to the typeface that was critical to this new invention in printmaking. The handle of the screw press that you see there is extended. And again, it's as if that instrument, that the printing press, is ready to use. On the sides of the printing press, you can see 2 lines, and hanging on those lines are prints that have just been printed and are there drying. And I think a lot of what this image speaks to is how printing is the linchpin of some of these other inventions. It's what makes knowledge of the other discoveries possible. It's what makes that knowledge able to disseminate quickly and easily. For instance, on the upper left, one of the discoveries that will be highlighted in this series is the discovery of America. So in 1942, Columbus sails to America. On his way back in 1493, he wrote a letter describing the first voyage. By the end of 1493, that letter had been printed and distributed so that knowledge of the voyage could be shared. So one of the things I want to emphasize here is that prints are instruments as well. And because what they do is, because prints are paper and they seem fragile and a little less potent, we don't think of them that way. But they are what made the pursuit of knowledge in all of these other fields possible. Can I have the next slide, Suzanne? So here we see two other sheets from the series. One depicts book printing on the left, and one depicts printing from copper plates. And you can see on both sheets how both of these practices are highly collaborative and take the work of specialized practitioners in order to make it happen. From, for instance, on the left, the typesetters on the far left, the figure in the back who is actually applying ink to the typeface, to the printer who is turning the printing press to create the pressure necessary. The same specialized knowledge is apparent in the right in the print that depicts printing from copper plate engravings. And I show you both of these because both of these techniques are going to be critical in the conversation as we proceed. And I just want to say that one of the things that makes both of these techniques in printing possible are innovations in metallurgy. In Central Europe in the 15th century. It was because of innovations in mining copper and silver ore that the production of these metals were possible for the printing plates and the scientific instruments that we are going to see. So I now turn it over to Pedro, who's going to talk a bit about some of the scientific instruments that we're going to look at.
Thank you, Susan. And can we have the next slide, please? And before I go into this, let me also thank Susan Karschmidt, Leah Markey, and the team at Newberry for inviting me to speak in this event. It's a great pleasure. And we're also very pleased to contribute with some instruments to the exhibit, which I must confess I haven't seen it, but I'm eager to go see it. And I have no excuse because I'm here in Chicago. I would like to pick up on this idea of this set of prints celebrating discovery and innovation. Discovery and innovation are very complex concepts in both the history of science and the history of technology. And when we start deconstructing those concepts, we often find that, well, the idea of sudden discoveries is a myth. And we often find a coexistence between the old and the new and how the two will combine. And I think this might be a case in point here. So the plate from Nova Reperta you see on your screens right now shows Amerigo Vespucci using an instrument supposedly observing the Southern Cross, which is a constellation you cannot see from the Northern Hemisphere. So this would be in a location, supposedly maybe South America. And supposedly this would be an important discovery. And why would that be? Well, the Southern Cross is a constellation that can be used to find the approximate location of the Southern Celestial Pole. In the Northern Hemisphere, we have the Pole Star, and the Pole Star is, of course, very important because it indicates the north, and you can measure the altitude of the Pole Star above the horizon to find your latitude. So, of course, it's a very important celestial object for the purpose of navigation. So when you go southwards beyond the equator, you no longer have that. So and interestingly, the reason why the North Star or the Pole Star is the Pole Star, it's because it just happens to be in the direction of the Earth's rotation axis, if you point northwards towards the celestial sphere. So that star, which is relatively bright, not very bright, but relatively bright, just happens to be there. It's not exactly coincident with the northern celestial pole. And in fact, it was further away from the pole in this period of time than it is today. But when you go southwards, you don't have a bright star indicating the southern pole. So this would have been an important discovery. Find at least the constellation that helps you find the position of the southern celestial pole. Did Amerigo Vespucci discover it? He really didn't. So interestingly, in antiquity, even Ptolemy mentioned the stars of the Southern Cross, not by that name, because at the time, so we're talking 2nd century AD and before in ancient Greece, by that time the constellation was visible in European latitudes, but it ceased to be. And you see that on the left side, left-hand side of the print, you see Dante Alighieri. So Dante mentioned the Southern Cross in a letter, maybe because he was aware of these ancient references to the constellation. But now can we have the next slide? Let's see what Amerigo Vespucci is doing. He did, in fact, described some of the stars of this constellation. And supposedly here, he's holding a pair of dividers on his right hand, and is holding an instrument with his left hand, and it seems that he's doing something between an observation and a measurement. You might have noticed that this plate is titled Astrolabe. Now, it's very interesting that we don't see an astrolabe in the plate. So what's going on here? If you look to the right-hand side of the slide, you see on top a planispheric astrolabe. And this is mostly what we refer to when we talk about astrolabes. Importantly, the word astrolabe is applied to different kinds of instruments which are not necessarily related or directly related. And this is important. We'll be talking about another kind of astrolabe later. Okay, but you see that what Vespucci is holding is definitely not a planispheric astrolabe. Now, what he's holding seems to be clearly an Armillary sphere, and the Armillary sphere is the other instrument you see on your right-hand side just below the astrolabe. I have to say that it will be very unlikely that Vespucci would be holding a planispheric astrolabe to observe the stars of the Southern Cross, because it's not clear what he will be doing with that. And normally, most of the surviving astrolabes are projected for the Northern Hemisphere. So you see that in this celebration of innovation discovery, there are a lot of layers here, and some things are quite problematic. But now if we can advance to the next slide, there's one thing that in a sense makes sense in the whole construction of the image. If we approach it not from the functional side or not from the perspective of the function of the instruments, but from their symbolic aspect and their symbolic meaning. In fact, the Armillary sphere has a connection with the astrolabe, because the planispheric astrolabe, I have a metal model here. To a certain extent, this is to a great extent, this is basically a projection of the things you see on an Armillary sphere and on a celestial globe. So you stereographic projection, and you create a functional model of the geocentric universe that you can more easily carry around. And importantly, you can use it as an analog computer and also as an observing instrument. But the sphere, the Armillary sphere, which is a model of the geocentric universe, it basically encapsulates and symbolizes the tradition we can call the tradition of the sphere from antiquity then into the Middle Ages, that encapsulates and represents the basic knowledge about astronomy and cosmography that provides the basis for navigation. So on the screen right now, you see two images, a medieval illustration where a scholar uses an Armillary sphere, supposedly to teach astronomy to a student or a bystander. We know that the Armillary sphere was originally an observing instrument. In the Middle Ages, becomes essentially a teaching and demonstration instrument. On the image on the right, which is the frontispiece from Laurence Finet's Cosmographia, you see that we have the two elements, the two instruments creating this symbolic scene of the mastery of astronomy. See that the Armillary sphere and all its astronomical circles are superimposed to a model of the orbits of the planets and of the fixed stars with the Earth at the center. And then on the bottom, you have Laurence Finet holding an astrolabe and apparently presenting it to Urania, the muse of astronomy. So again, going back to that image of Vespucci holding the sphere, it doesn't really make sense from the perspective of the functionality of the instruments, what they made, but perhaps it encapsulates this idea that the sphere, and by mastering the knowledge of the sphere, and by going to the Southern Hemisphere, by learning about the stars in the Southern Hemisphere that are not visible, from the Northern Hemisphere. These people in the 16th century were basically encapsulating and dominating the whole world. And I think that's probably what that image is meant to, the message that image is meant to convey. I don't know if you want to add something, Susan.
No, I know the next slide coming up, and I know or the video coming up, and that's an exciting piece of it. So I'm anxious for that.
Okay, so what we have next. So now we want to give you a close view of a planispheric astrolabe. So if we can go back to the slide, please. This is one of two astrolabes we have at the Adler Planetarium, which were made by Georg Hartmann. Hartmann was based in Nuremberg in the 16th century. He was a prominent instrument maker. There are a few dozen instruments made by Hartmann that survive. We are lucky to have two astrolabes made by him here at the Adler. This is one of them. This one was made in 1540. And we have a video to show you the main parts of the astrolabe. I want to remark that this is not the most typical Hartmann astrolabe that we're going to see. There are some features here which are slightly different from usual, but at least you'll get to see what the main parts of an astrolabe are. So here, I have to say I was very excited to shoot this video because I've been at the Adler Planetarium for 5 years, and because we have had this on display forever, this was the first time I actually got to examine it closely, these two astrolabes. This is actually an astrolabe. This is the other Hartmann astrolabe. This one was made in 1532. And what you see right now, so that intricate structure you see, that's called the reed, it's a map of the sky. I'm right now pointing to the star pointers. So those pierced star pointers indicate the positions of stars in the sky. And now I will flip over the instrument and you'll get to see some features on the back. So it has a calendar that allows you to find the position of the sun in the ecliptic for a given date. And importantly, you have an alidate with sides. So right now I'm actually unfolding the sides. And this is the part of the instrument that you use to point at celestial objects. You see there are pinholes, so you have to align the pinholes with the object. Now you see that the alidate can move, then you can read the angle between the object and the horizon. So you see, so on the front, essentially you have a map of the sky, and you also have a grid of coordinates for your latitude. On the back, you have an observing instrument. So the astrolabe is a very versatile instrument that doubles as an analog computer and as an observing instrument. If you carry out observations of certain stars or of the sun, then you can go back to the front of the instrument and, for example, find the time from the stars of the sun. But you could do plenty of other things with an astrolabe.
Yeah. And I think it's also talking about the function. Let's talk about it a bit as a material object, Pedro. So it is an object made from brass components that have been incised with lines and figures and other designs. So those incision techniques are not unlike the techniques used to incise a copper plate for printing. And so someone like Georg Hartmann, who was in Nuremberg at the beginning, well, he's not working until the beginning of the 16th century, is in Nuremberg at the time that Albrecht Dürer is also there, making world-changing copper plate engravings. And it seems like there was at some point an aha moment for Hartmann, where he thought, like, these instruments made of metal that are incised actually kind of resemble printing plates. So what happens if we, in fact, start printing these component parts? Would you like to add to that, Pedro?
I want to, because this is a very interesting point. So Hartmann, we know, and I have to credit John Lamprey and Robert Gordon for wonderful work they did analyzing, doing a very thorough, detailed analysis of the instruments, the brass instruments and their materiality. And on the basis of evidence from that analysis, we can infer that Hartmann actually organized the work, the labor in his workshop into some kind of production line with a division of labor. And apparently he produces batches of instruments that were being made at the same time. I find it fascinating that Hartmann is going apparently to explore possibility of printing these instruments, which of course, when you have one astrolabe, of course, what I'm holding is just a replica. But these instruments were obviously complex, expensive, and difficult to make. So on the one hand, you have Hartmann really understanding, well, with a certain division of labor and organization of labor, we can produce more of these fine, complex, expensive instruments. But with the printing, we can produce cheaper instruments also in quantity. And I think quantity here is a key element. So what seems to me that there is that Hartmann understands that there are ways of making more of these instruments and also explore different market niches, because one of the things we have to also always take into account is that the astrolabe was certainly a complex and an expensive instrument that only a few would be able to could afford, and only very few would actually master and know how to operate properly.
Can we see the next slide, please? So, as Pedro mentioned, Hartmann began the production of paper astrolabes alongside his copper instruments. And what you see here is a woodcut, a sheet printed from a wood block on the left with the component pieces of the astrolabe. So Pedro showed you the reed, which is on the far left, with which is the map of the celestial bodies, in which it will point the pointed edges point to particular stars. So you have the face of the astrolabe on one side, and then the verso of the astrolabe on the other side, and the other pieces that are necessary for its construction. The alidade that Pedro told you was for sighting celestial bodies. You can see up at top there is the ring to hold the astrolabe upright, and there's a small rule to the bottom left. And the image on the right-hand side are the latitude plates that would be fit into the constructed astrolabe. Each of them represents a different latitude because, of course, the stars you see depend on where you are located. And so something like this, these prints could be offered as a kit. It could be taken home, the pieces would be cut out, perhaps pasted to cardboard or wood, and assembled, and would be fully functional. It's kind of an amazing innovation to go from these highly specialized brass precision scientific instruments and translate them to paper. Now, there aren't a lot of these that have survived, the printed sheets nor the assembled astrolabes, most likely because they were put to great use. And Pedro mention some past scholars. And I actually want to mention Susan Carr-Schmidt, your very own curator at the Newberry Library, who also has done remarkable research on Hartmann and these paper instruments, and has found versions of them in obscure libraries across Europe. So she too is a scholar of this incredible material, if you have more questions after this particular session. But the translation to paper is a remarkable one. And let me just add one thing. I'm sorry. And as you know, I started by saying that prints in that index were a kind of metaphorical instrument in the way that they're represented on the frontispiece. But here, they actually become functional instruments as well. Can we see the next slide? Oh, sorry, Pedro, go. We're going.
I just wanted to make the point just to remark before everyone how clever and how powerful Hartmann's idea was. Here's the proof. 500 years later, we still sell cardboard astrolabe kits at the Adler. It's very much the same kind of thing that Hartmann does. And guess what? It's a bestseller. It's very interesting.
Yeah. Can we have the next slide, please? You know, it's a bestseller for a lot of reasons. You know, it allows you to identify and predict the placement of the stars in the sky. It allows you to tell time. As you can see on the verso, there are also the signs of the zodiac for casting predictions. So they had multiple uses. And this is the kind of workshop that such an instrument, woodcut instrument, would have been printed in. Instead of the typesetters, as you can see on the left, laying the letters in a form, an incised, a carved wooden block would have been put in that same kind of press, and an image like this would have been printed. So this kind of press that is called out in the Nova Reperta was suitable for both printing text and images. And I just want to, while Pedro had mentioned one of the value of these paper instruments was their multiplicity. And I think it very much rhymes with the verse that's printed on the bottom of the sheet to the left. And it reads, "Just as one voice can be heard by a multitude of ears, so a single text can cover 1,000 sheets." So I think that that's a really great description of what's possible through printmaking. As someone speaking can speak to 1,000 ears, this printing can be made available to 1,000 eyes and be available to be cut out. Can we see the next slide, please? And here is a version of the verso of one of Hartmann's astrolabes, printed as an engraving. So in this case, it's printed from a copper plate, not unlike the hammered sheets of brass that were produced to create the instruments themselves. And to make this print, Hartmann or someone in his studio cut the copper plate to the shape of this particular component of the astrolabe. You can see the plate mark around the edges much better if you've seen it in person. And for the engraved version of the instrument, each piece, each component, the recto, the verso, the alidade, the rete, all would have been printed on separate sheets. And we know from the physical evidence of them that there are holes in the sheets where they would have been tied together in a packet and sold as a kit. So it's another great example of Hartmann's entrepreneurial spirit when he was making these. Pedro, have you seen many of these printed sheets with the components of astrolabes and other instruments? Because of course, Hartmann also made sundials, and the various instruments are also come in paper, printed paper versions.
No, I haven't, Susan. And we have something very interesting here. I would like to pick up on that. You mentioned that not that many paper instruments survive, and let alone assembled instruments. We are lucky to have in the collections of the Adler Planetarium, so we have 113 astrolabes. We can claim it's one of the best and largest collections of astrolabes in the world. I'm talking about planispheric astrolabes, this kind of instrument. Yet, we are still very lucky. We have 2 Hartmanns, 2 brass Hartmann astrolabes. Yet, we are very lucky to have one fully assembled paper astrolabe, which I believe we have a video that we can show. And this is quite remarkable, which leads me to think, okay, I think we have to ask the question, but so if the idea here was some kind of mass production, but then the brass instruments, we have more brass instruments, those that were made, okay, Hartmann was already trying to produce them in quantity, but these were pieces that required a lot of work, time, etc., expensive. Yet, those that were made supposedly for a broader market and produced in large quantities, those don't survive. Here you have, so this is a version of the astrolabe originally printed by Philippe d'Amphrey in 1578. Then he updated the astrolabe, that printed astrolabe because of the reformation of the calendar for the Gregorian calendar. And this is a later version by Jean Moreau, who got hold of apparently of the copper plates. And so basically reprinted, made some adaptations and reprinted the astrolabe. So this is a fully assembled version of, example of the 1622 version of the D'Amphrey astrolabe by Jean Moreau. And this is quite remarkable. I think you can get the feeling from the video, and those are my hands. When I'm molding this, I have to say, I was a bit shivering. Gosh, this is really fragile. And it's, I would say, stunning that it still survives. Now, there's a very important point here that should not escape us in terms of museum collections, and this is something I have to deal with as a museum curator. And the question is, to what extent does a museum collection provide an accurate picture of the past? And clearly we have biases in the collections. There are certain instruments that will tend to survive to the detriment of others. And clearly here we have a good example. It's almost a paradox, but we see that those expensive complex brass instruments implying more labor to produce, etc., etc., we have quite a substantial number of surviving examples of that. Yet this one, the mass-produced paper instrument, only a few survive. And this is also a good reminder. We shouldn't take it for granted that when we look at the collection and what we have, even in a world-class collection like the Adler's, we have to be cautious that doesn't necessarily provide an accurate view of the instruments that were the most widely used, the best sellers, etc., etc. And this is certainly a case in point.
Yeah, absolutely. But I think that, like, Susan Carr-Schmidt's dissertation research and her work for the exhibition that we did at Harvard, Prints in the Pursuit of Knowledge, once she started looking in print collections, especially across Germany, the number of uncut sheets was significant, actually. And I'm sure that if one continued to dig in different collections, primarily in Europe, as they're European made, one would find more and more examples of them, especially the uncut sheets.
Well, definitely, it's also a matter of where we are looking, what we are looking for, of course, which will also, of course, determine what we can find. But you raised a very interesting point here, Susan, which is you mentioned uncut sheets, and this leads us to ask another question, which is, these instruments were produced, were there, were available, or certainly marketed, were purchased, we would assume. To what extent were they actually used? So who would be able and willing to actually use these instruments? And this is another issue we have, because we know that many of these fine instruments, even though, for example, we saw the two examples of the brass Hartmann astrolabes, those are fully functional. But they are also, well, beautiful, exquisite, fine instruments that whose function could simply be living in someone's cabinet as a symbol of intellectual sophistication. So this interplay between functionality, use, and the actual practicality of the instrument is a very complex one, and more interesting when we bring the print culture into play.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there were instances of the printed sheets that came with instructions for how to assemble the instruments as well, and then how to use the instruments. So I think that they could have had a popular appeal.
All right, I think this is a good segue, this idea of use, to move back to the Nova Reperta for just a little bit and talk about the Mariner's astrolabes, which I think may be the only astrolabes that were not made in paper, for obvious reasons, because they were used on board ship, and that would be silly. So Pedro, I think you might have some thoughts about where most Mariner's astrolabes are found, but we wanted to get into that and then finish up with a video of one of your Armillary spheres.
Sure, I want to show you something briefly. So this is the first guide of the Adler Planetarium, written by the first director, the astronomer Philip Fox. And we've had a collection of scientific instruments from the very beginning, which he actually presents and describes in the guide. And of course, he very proudly talks about the planispheric astrolabes. And then he mentions, it says this: now the Mariner's astrolabe, that instrument, the Adler didn't have one. We only got our first and so far only real historical surviving Mariner's astrolabe in the 1980s. And Philip Fox says, these instruments are to be found in the bottom of the sea. And he was absolutely right. So the Mariner's astrolabe, it's a simple, very simple instrument, which was designed for a very specific function. For seamen navigators who didn't necessarily have a very solid background in navigational science or cosmography, would know maybe some very basic things. So that instrument was meant for those men on board of a ship or ashore during travel, to use the instrument to measure the altitude at the sun, of the sun at noon, or the altitude of the pole star. In both cases, the purpose of this operation was to find the ship's latitude or the latitude of a location ashore when navigators arrived at some point inland. So we know, nowadays we know roughly over 100 Mariner's astrolabes, and roughly 50% of those were in fact found in shipwrecks. So finding Mariner's astrolabes, that's the province of marine archaeology. And this is very telling, and this leads us back to what we we're just talking about, the stuff we have in museums. How does that really represent the past? Well, we only have this one Mariner's astrolabe in the Adler's collection. And as I mentioned, it came to the Adler in the 1980s. This is part of a series of a group of Mariner's astrolabes called the Atocha astrolabes, because they were retrieved between the 1970s and the 1980s from the shipwreck of the galleon Nuestra Senora da Atocha, which sank off the Marquesas in 1621. So this instrument, which you can see on your screen on the plate from Nova Reporta, showing supposedly, I suppose, Columbus or the European conqueror arriving in America and holding a mariner's astrolabe in his hand. So the astrolabe being the tool that provides for the determination of latitude at sea, being a tool that empowers navigators to go around the world, and of course kingdoms to create seaborne empires, because these instruments empower navigators to make navigation more accurate and trustworthy. Was that always the case? Well, probably not, and in fact it wasn't. There were many problems surrounding navigation. One of the most vexing problems of navigation was finding longitude. There were many ideas at this point in time in the 16th century about how to do it. It was only solved efficiently by the late 18th century. And of course, these tools should never be seen as miraculous tools that solve all the problems. And I always like to emphasize that the fact that we need to go to the shipwrecks to find these instruments further suggests that the instrument per se didn't assure that the ships will go and come back safely, because in many cases they didn't. So now the instrument itself. We have to be careful with making a direct connection between this kind of instrument and the planispheric astrolabe, which we talked about earlier in this conversation. We don't know any evidence that shows a direct link. They do look alike. There are clearly resemblances. Here, basically, you have two features that you also find in an astrolabe. You have an alidade and you have divided scales in degrees so that you can measure the altitude of a celestial body. We have a video just to show you, not the instrument which is right now at the Nova Reporta exhibition at the Newberry, but a replica of an instrument from the early 17th century that we also have at the Adler. So this is a replica from that instrument. And see, this is a heavy instrument. So the idea is that you need it to be vertical and stable while you are standing on the deck of a ship. So right now you see my finger pointing at the divided degree scale. And so you see that there's one scale on each side. Here's the alidade that you can move, and the alidade has two sides. Of course, you'll now see the pinholes on the sides, so that you can align the alidade with the object under observation. And when you do that, then you can read the altitude of that object. It will be either the sun at noon, in some cases it will be the North Star if you are navigating in the Northern Hemisphere. And this gives you an idea of how you are supposed to hold the instrument, especially if you are observing the sun. Of course, you don't look directly at the sun. You make sure the sun rays get through the two pinholes, and you align the alidade to make that happen. And then you read the altitude on the scale. An interesting detail, some people might have noticed that the numbering of the divisions goes from top to and then goes all the way down. It starts at the top. So what you get here is actually not altitude, you get zenith distance, which is just the complementary. And why is that? This is another practical aspect of the instrument. If you are observing the sun, and if you are using tables of solar declination to find the latitude of a ship at sea, if you just get the zenith distance immediately out of the instrument, it makes the calculation easier. This is another aspect on the instrument itself that further shows that this device was conceived for practical use by people who did not necessarily have that much instruction in navigation to make it simple and practical. I didn't mention it, but you also notice that the instrument has those 4 holes. That's another indication that it was made to be used in ships. So basically, when you're standing on a ship, if you use an instrument, so a solid body instrument like this astrolabe, of course, the wind will hit the instrument and make it bounce. So the fact that you have holes that the wind can go through also helps keeping the instrument stable. So again, a tool made for the purpose of practical use. And interestingly, on account of that, and because it's not a kind of beautiful, intriguing, exquisite instrument that would look nice in the cabinet of curiosities or in the study of a prominent scholar, the examples that survive are much fewer than those of finer instruments.
Pedro, that's an excellent segue to or the last object you wanted to speak a little bit more about, the armillary sphere. We've definitely had questions about its function, but if we want to look at the next slide, I think both of you will have thoughts about collecting instruments in various ways. And I just wanted to say that I've definitely seen, I think mostly 18th century armillary spheres that are made from printed components, but pasted mainly on wood. So all of these paper instruments would have been glued to a malleable but more solid underlayer. Take it away.
Well, I can comment on that, Suzanne. I spent some time studying those armillary spheres that you mentioned, made of paper and wood, etc. The armillary sphere, of course, it's an old instrument, and it's more than an instrument. It's really this concept that in one single instrument you create a model, an encompassing model of the universe. So most armillary spheres, and here on the screen right now, you see the print about the lodestone and magnetism from Nova Ruperta, and you see that there is an armillary sphere sitting on the table. Again, I want to emphasize that neither the armillary sphere nor the planispheric astrolabe are navigation instruments. They were not used for navigation, but they were in fact representative of this system of knowledge that provides the, if you will, the theoretical foundations for navigation. Then you have the empirical part of navigation, of which the mariner's astrolabe is a representative tool. But back to the armillary sphere, on the right hand of the slide, right-hand side of your slide right now, you see an armillary sphere, which suppose it's the armillary sphere that's on display in the exhibition at the Newberry. And so basically that's a framework of several rings that represent the major circles in the sky. And when you use this spherical framework of rings and you put it on a stand with an horizon ring, you get a functional model of the celestial sphere. So if we can go to the video now, we will show you an armillary sphere made by Michel Coignet in the 16th century in Antwerp. So Michel Coignet was a prominent instrument maker in Antwerp who served as a military engineer and instrument maker to the Archduke Albert of Austria. And here you have, so you see, so you have, those are actually unusual. Those are star pointers, which normally you don't see in the armillary spheres. What you see here, this is an hour ring. And you see that that's the signature of the maker, Michael Coignet or Michel Coignet. And so you can actually revolve and move the sphere, rotate the sphere around its axis. And by doing so, which is what I'm doing right now, just very gently. So by doing so, you are basically reproducing and simulating the apparent motion of the celestial sphere if you are just observing the sky. So this is a functional model of the celestial motions. Now, if you want to add something, Suzanne, to this discussion.
Well, again, you can see the congruences to print technology and the way that the metal is inscribed. And I even noticed on this and some of the other brass instruments that you showed that the incisions are darkened to make them more legible. And I'm guessing that's done with some medium that contains carbon, you know, not unlike printing ink. So, you know, I see these instruments and I'm always surprised by their relationship. Not surprised, but I think that there's so much more that can be teased out about their relationship to printing, even in the way that they're signed, in the same way that copper plates are signed before they're printed. So again, why we're talking about printing and scientific instruments in the same program.
All right, thank you both. I think we're just at 5 minutes, and I wanted to make sure you could take one question at least from a very good group. So could we try to open it up a little bit more globally, which is something we try to do in the exhibition, even though the prints are European and a lot of the instruments we've been looking at are. Owen Williams from the folder has asked, could you speak to the trajectory of these instruments and technologies from the ancient world to the European Renaissance? And specifically wondering how prominent a role Islamic scholars played.
I can go first on that one. It's an excellent question and an excellent point. And I have to say, of course, the planispheric astrolabe is a case in point. It's an example of an instrument which concept actually basically has its roots in ancient Greece. We believe around the 2nd century BC, at least the main knowledge you need to build an instrument like that. Then we see the first treatises on the construction and the use of the astrolabe appearing on the 3rd and 4th centuries BC. And yes, it seems that it's from the 7th and 8th centuries onwards in the Middle East and in regions under the influence of Islamic culture that the astrolabe really starts to thrive. Absolutely. So the astrolabe was used, made and developed by Islamic instrument makers and scholars. Then eventually that knowledge radiates in two directions, through Northern Africa, through the Maghreb, and it eventually reaches the Iberian Peninsula. And from the 13th century onwards, you start having an European tradition of astrolabe making emerging in Europe. And I would say that the acme of that is actually Hartmann. Hartmann is very representative at the European tradition of astrolabe making at its utmost. Then in the 17th century, because the astrolabe, the planispheric astrolabe was so complex, it starts to be replaced with, and it loses prominence to other instruments which are simpler and more specialized. And maybe the fact that you have printed astrolabes as well also contributes to the waning of this complex metal planispheric astrolabe. But then the astrolabe, the planispheric astrolabe remains in use in the Islamic world until the 19th century, for sure. And also importantly, by the 16th and 17th centuries, the knowledge of this instrument had moved from the Middle East towards what became the Mughal Empire in the Indian subcontinent. And by the 17th century, you have very good and very skillful instrument makers making astrolabes in Lahore, which is nowadays Pakistan. To summarize, yes, the planispheric astrolabe is really the kind of instrument that shows that we much approach these not as an invention, going back to the point we were talking about in the beginning, but as a process with many different contributions.
Oh, same thing for the invention of paper instruments. We had several questions about those. We're very close to out of time, and anyone who has additional questions can write to us to get some more questions, but answered. But there were a couple were. Could these instruments really be accurate? Could they tell, get a correct altitude measurement? And I think I can answer Jeff Shoemaker saying yes, there were different latitude plates for brass instruments. Also, the interchangeability was exactly the same. So yes, just addressing the accuracy, I guess.
Well, my quick answer to that will be, yes, the instruments were accurate to a certain level. Of course, that we know, for example, the analysis of Hartmann's astrolabes revealed that the markings and all the lines, etc., were quite accurate. Now, for example, a mariner's astrolabe, you could get a certain level of accuracy, but of course, that instrument was replaced for a reason, or for several reasons, because it wasn't as accurate as later instruments, or such, for example, as the cross staff, and then later, of course, the sextant, of which I also have an example here. So the quick answer is good instruments being made and used by people who master them could be accurate to a certain level.
But the
Of course, we have
paper
to-
ones as well.
And the
It
paper
really
one-
depends on how well you actually put them together. If you do it wrong, all bets are off. So yeah. Okay, well, I think, so Susan, you want to jump in?
I just want to, and I want to just comment on the longevity of those paper instruments, something that I've realized as I've been watching this presentation, and we saw the Danfree, which is mounted on wood. The cutout paper is glued down to a wood substrate. You know, that wood is going to leach acid that's going to degrade the paper. And you can even tell from that object that the degradation has happened and darkened the sheet. I mean, I'm sure that contributes to why they don't survive in great number. But just having seen the number of them in collections that are unknown, that are uncut, I know that there are more of them out there, and that, I mean, my sense really is that they were produced in significant number, used and degraded or were discarded. So to be able to see these examples that have survived is really fantastic.
I couldn't agree more. So so everyone, write to renaissance@newberry.org with additional questions. We'll try to follow up with you if you left your information with your questions in the chat. And I have to say a big thanks to Pedro and Susan. This was amazing. Very close to my heart, this particular topic. And we hope some people can come see the show or look at it digitally. And I'm going to turn it over to Karin Christensen just to wrap us up. Thank you so much for coming.
Thank you so much. Thanks, Suzanne. Thanks, Pedro.
Thanks, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you, Susan, Pedro, and Suzanne, for this fascinating discussion. So interesting to reflect on the remarkable innovations of the past and how they spread throughout the world. And I'd also like again to thank our sponsor for this program, the Kress Foundation. And thanks to all of you for joining us today. A recording of this program will be available on the Newberry's YouTube channel in a few days. So if you missed any of it, you can check it out there. Newberry programs remain free and open to the public thanks to the generosity of our donors. During this critical time, we need the support of our entire community. So please support the Newberry Library by making a gift. You can give online at newberry.org/give. You also can see the exhibition Renaissance Invention, Stradamus's Nova Reperta, in person at the Newberry through November 25th. We look forward to welcoming visitors back to events at the Newberry as soon as it's safe to do so. In the meantime, please join us for our next virtual program on Tuesday, November 17th at 5 p.m. Central Time. It will be the second in our Wagner lecture series, and it's called Transience and Hope, a return to Freud in a time of pandemic with Jonathan Lear. You can register for this and other programs on our website, newberry.org.